when we are not sleeping well, the body becomes kind of ratcheted up or kind of more sympathetic dominant. I've talked about this idea before on the podcast, but very briefly. Within the central nervous system, we have two branches of the autonomic nervous system. So when you think of autonomic, think of just automatic, like things that happen. We're breathing right now. We're thinking about a posture. Maybe you're digesting your last meal. There's a certain heart rate, respiratory rate, oxygen perfusion and saturation. These are all controlled by the autonomic system, right? Like you're not thinking about breathing and yet you're breathing, a certain amount of, there's a certain respiratory rate that you maintain through the day. So within that automatic or autonomic system, we have parasympathetic and sympathetic. So sympathetic is not, I often joke, it's not like a state of being, like you're not feeling like, oh, sweetheart, oh, I feel so sympathetic. It's not, it's sort of a misnomer. The sympathetic system is what we traditionally think of as the fight, flight, freeze part of our nervous system, where we see a lot of the blood, let's say perfusion in the body, that's preferentially thrown into the periphery. So it is saved for, if you will, the muscles so that we can fight or flight, get away from or fight the proverbial tiger, or the deer in headlights, right? We've all, maybe if you have gone up to the cottage or you've ever, been driving on a highway, in the country, you may have seen a deer, and once they, that's, as that saying goes, the deer in headlights, once they sense danger, they can often just freeze. So that's the sympathetic system. So when we are not sleeping properly, the body becomes much more driven by and locked into this sympathetic nervous system. And that can, in the short term, be very advantageous for survival. But when we are chronically ratcheting up this system, it is going to lead to chronic stress and inflammation. So a little bit of cortisol, a little bit of adrenaline, a little bit of noradrenaline. These things are all very important for survival. So I don't want to demonize cortisol, because cortisol is actually very, very important in terms of our, daily metabolic, thyroid function, getting us up in the morning, all the things. But when we are sort of locked into this sympathetic nervous system, this is when it can go awry, when we lack that balance, right? We lack that yin and that yang. And what happens, of course, is when we have that low-grade inflammation, when we have that low-grade stress, as I mentioned, there's the acute and the chronic. So I'm really going to focus on the chronic aspect of this. Like acute, just for completeness here, acute inflammation can happen in the physical realm, the chemical realm, the emotional or spiritual realm. So like an acute physical injury might be, hurting yourself at the gym, spraining an ankle, that kind of thing, hurting your neck, waking up with a creak in the neck. That might be an acute representation of physical stress. Acute chemical stress might be medication that you take, if you're, sick and you're taking an antibiotic or you're immunized, that kind of thing. An emotional stress is going to be, an acute one might be, an unexpected passing, let's say, of a loved one, something like that. Chronic, which is where I really want to focus on when we're thinking about the physical aspect of it. Let's say you have a creak in the neck and you don't get it fixed. You're not seeing your chiropractor or whatever. You're going to now be developing these compensatory patterns of movement. So instead of turning your head 80 to 90 degrees to the right and 80 to 90 degrees to the left, maybe you're now, because you don't have that rotation, maybe now you're trying to elicit more extension, let's say. So just as an example. And now this is becoming like a nagging neck pain, nagging shoulder pain, right? Chemical chronic stress, let's say, is unknown exposure to toxins, like maybe you have mold in the home. Especially in older homes, this is a big concern. It could be the diet that you're following, or consistent and persistent requirement of taking any kind of medication. And then the emotional, of course, chronic tension and stress, as you might imagine, might be something like ongoing tension with a family member, friction with a partner, your even, maybe it's your husband or your wife, maybe it is your mother, or maybe it's even just unresolved maltreatment or trauma as a child, right? So this can leave residue. I like to talk about this as residue on the nervous system. Why am I talking about this? Why is this important? Well, when we have this chronic low-grade inflammation and stress, It is going to affect our sleep, but it's also going to have some metabolic consequences as well. So it is going to switch you to more of an inefficient means of producing energy. So part of the reason why we sleep, right, is so that we can have energy the next day to be able to perform and live our lives to, at 100% if we want to. And when we are now in this chronic state of inflammation, we are going to increase something called reactive oxygen species. So we're going to increase oxidative damage. So you're going to age faster. It's going to reduce your insulin sensitivity. So insulin, again, another hormone that you have probably heard about in terms of metabolic health. It's very famously, linked with type 2 diabetes, but we need insulin, right? The thyroid needs insulin, for example, to convert inactive thyroid T4, inactive hormone T4 to the active form, which is T3. So insulin is actually very, very important. And when we are now in this inefficient way of producing energy. So for those of you that want to know what the heck do I mean by inefficient means of producing energy? It is basically switching us from what is called oxidative phosphorylation, or OXPHOS, which happens in the mitochondria, to a less efficient means of energy production, which is called aerobic glycolysis. So you're still able to produce energy when you have this chronic low-grade inflammation, but it is less efficient. So you're going to be producing less ATP, less energy. That is the currency of our energy, is adenosine triphosphate, and this is going to result in reduced glucose availability because your insulin sensitivity is down, and therefore it's sort of this vicious cycle where now you're going to also, because you have reduced glucose availability for the cell, you're going to now have reduced cellular energy because you have less glucose getting into the cell to be able to make that ATP.